Understanding inheritance. In this video, we will explore the fascinating world of genetics and how traits are passed down from one generation to the next. Genetics is the study of heredity, which is the passing of traits from parents to their offspring. Understanding genetics is essential to understanding how living organisms evolve and adapt to their environment. Genetics is a complex subject, but we will break it down into 5 segments to make it easier to understand. In this first segment, we will cover the basics of genetics and inheritance. We will discuss the history of genetics, the key players in the field, and the fundamental principles of inheritance. The study of genetics began in the mid-1800s when Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk, conducted experiments on pea plants. Mendel discovered that traits were passed down from parents to offspring in a predictable pattern. He is known as the father of genetics, and his work laid the foundation for the field. Since Mendel's time, many scientists have contributed to our understanding of genetics. In the early 1900s, Thomas Hunt Morgan discovered that genes were located on chromosomes. Later, James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the structure of DNA, which is the molecule that carries genetic information. The fundamental principles of inheritance are based on the laws of probability. Each parent contributes half of their genetic material to their offspring, and the combination of genes determines the traits that are expressed. Some traits are dominant, meaning they are expressed even if only one copy of the gene is present. Other traits are recessive, meaning they are only expressed if 2 copies of the gene are present. In the next segment, we will dive deeper into the structure of DNA and how it carries genetic information. We will also discuss how mutations can occur and how they can affect an organism's traits. In the previous segment, we discussed the fundamental principles of inheritance and the key players in the field of genetics. In this segment, we will dive deeper into the structure of DNA and how it carries genetic information. We will also discuss how mutations can occur and how they can affect an organism's traits. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is the molecule that carries genetic information in all living organisms. It is a long, double-stranded molecule that is made up of 4 nucleotide bases: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. The sequence of these bases determines the genetic code that is carried by the DNA. The structure of DNA was discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953. They found that the 2 strands of DNA are held together by hydrogen bonds between the nucleotide bases. The sequence of these bases determines the genetic code that is carried by the DNA. Mutations are changes in the DNA sequence that can occur naturally or as a result of exposure to environmental factors such as radiation or chemicals. Mutations can be harmful, beneficial, or have no effect on an organism's traits. Harmful mutations can lead to genetic disorders or diseases, while beneficial mutations can provide an advantage in certain environments. There are several types of mutations, including point mutations, insertions, and deletions. Point mutations are changes in a single nucleotide base, while insertions and deletions involve the addition or removal of nucleotide bases. These mutations can affect the way that genes are expressed and can lead to changes in an organism's traits. In the next segment, we will discuss how traits are inherited and how genetic disorders can be passed down from parents to their offspring. In the previous segment, we discussed the structure of DNA and how mutations can occur. In this segment, we will discuss how traits are inherited and how genetic disorders can be passed down from parents to their offspring. As we mentioned earlier, each parent contributes half of their genetic material to their offspring. The combination of genes determines the traits that are expressed in the offspring. Some traits are dominant, meaning they are expressed even if only 1 copy of the gene is present. Other traits are recessive, meaning they are only expressed if 2 copies of the gene are present. Genetic disorders are caused by mutations in genes that affect the way that traits are expressed. These disorders can be inherited in several ways, including autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, and X-linked inheritance. Autosomal dominant disorders are caused by mutations in genes that are located on autosomes, which are non-sex chromosomes. These disorders are expressed even if only 1 copy of the mutated gene is present. Examples of autosomal dominant disorders include Huntington's disease and Marfan syndrome. Autosomal recessive disorders are caused by mutations in genes that are located on autosomes. These disorders are only expressed if 2 copies of the mutated gene are present, 1 from each parent. Examples of autosomal recessive disorders include cystic fibrosis and sickle cell anemia. X-linked disorders are caused by mutations in genes that are located on the X chromosome. These disorders are more common in males because they only have 1 X chromosome. Females have 2 X chromosomes, so they are less likely to be affected by X-linked disorders. Examples of X-linked disorders include hemophilia and color blindness. Genetic counseling can help individuals and families understand their risk of inheriting genetic disorders. Genetic testing can also be used to identify mutations that may increase the risk of developing certain disorders. In the next segment, we will discuss the role of genetics in evolution and adaptation. In the previous segment, we discussed how genetic disorders can be inherited and the different types of inheritance patterns. In this segment, we will discuss the role of genetics in evolution and adaptation. Evolution is the process by which species change over time in response to changes in their environment. Genetics plays a crucial role in evolution because it is the mechanism by which traits are passed down from one generation to the next. Natural selection is the driving force behind evolution. It is the process by which organisms that are better adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, the traits that are advantageous in a particular environment become more common in the population. Genetic variation is essential for natural selection to occur. Without genetic variation, there would be no differences in traits for natural selection to act upon. Genetic variation can arise through mutations, genetic recombination, and gene flow. Mutations can introduce new traits into a population. Genetic recombination occurs during meiosis when homologous chromosomes exchange genetic material. Gene flow occurs when individuals from one population migrate to another and introduce new genes into the population. Genetic drift is another mechanism that can affect the frequency of traits in a population. Genetic drift occurs when chance events cause certain traits to become more or less common in a population. Genetic drift is more likely to occur in small populations. In summary, genetics plays a crucial role in evolution and adaptation. Genetic variation is essential for natural selection to occur, and mutations, genetic recombination, and gene flow can introduce new traits into a population. Genetic drift can also affect the frequency of traits in a population. In the final segment, we will discuss the ethical and social implications of genetics and genetic testing. In the previous segment, we discussed the role of genetics in evolution and adaptation. In this final segment, we will discuss the ethical and social implications of genetics and genetic testing. Genetic testing can provide valuable information about an individual's risk of developing certain diseases or passing on genetic disorders to their offspring. However, genetic testing also raises ethical concerns about privacy, discrimination, and eugenics. Privacy concerns arise because genetic information is highly personal and sensitive. There is a risk that genetic information could be used against individuals, such as by insurance companies or employers. Laws have been put in place to protect individuals from genetic discrimination, but there is still a need for continued vigilance. Discrimination based on genetic information is also a concern. Individuals who are found to have a higher risk of developing certain diseases may face discrimination in employment, housing, or other areas of life. This type of discrimination is illegal, but it still occurs. Eugenics is the idea that certain traits should be promoted or discouraged through selective breeding or genetic engineering. Eugenics has a dark history, including forced sterilization and genocide. The use of genetic engineering to create designer babies is also a concern. In addition to these ethical concerns, there are also social implications of genetics. The ability to test for genetic disorders raises questions about the value of human life and the ethics of abortion. It also raises questions about the responsibility of individuals to their offspring and the role of society in supporting individuals with genetic disorders. In conclusion, genetics is a complex and fascinating field that has the potential to improve human health and well-being. However, it also raises ethical and social concerns that must be addressed. As we continue to advance our understanding of genetics, it is important to consider the implications of this knowledge and to ensure that it is used for the benefit of all individuals in society as a whole.